they have known for decades about this pervasive problem of pastors sexually abusing kids and congregants. Decades. That's documented. It's not even really factually up for debate anymore. They have known. There have been multiple exposés. They've had multiple opportunities to earnestly reckon with this, and they have not.
In my heart and mind you'll stay. I can make it through the night.
I myself would not have believed it because it's very, very dark
Right.
to imagine that human beings will not safeguard the well-being of children.
Always, always with me.
Whatever you do, it is just such an awful place to be, and such a painful choice. So I would say, number one, be gentle. And number two, I would hope that you would not sacrifice the truth of your own reality for the sake of something false.
It's your hand to fight. In each hour of
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this Grace Live conversation. As most of you know, Grace stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. Our very simple mission is to educate and empower churches and ministries to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse. Thanks for joining us today. I encourage you to stay tuned until the end when we're going to share some exciting information about an upcoming publicly offered training webinar on spiritual abuse. Today, I am your co-host. I'm Mike Sloan. I'm the director of Safeguarding at Grace. My co-host today is David Pittman. David, come on out here. David is a safeguarding specialist at Grace. And from the start, David helped us develop our safeguarding initiative and the safeguarding work we do here at Grace. And even longer than that, David has been involved in advocating for reform in churches, in particular in the Southern Baptist Convention, the SBC, as a prominent survivor of abuse within the SBC, like our special guest today. David, hello. How are you today?
Hey, bud. I'm great, man. I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely. Well, today we have the honor of speaking with Christa Brown. Christa, welcome. How are you today?
Unmute.
Go ahead and unmute, Christa.
Sorry.
Oh, you're good.
I'm doing well. I'm grateful to be here. Thanks to all of y'all for being here.
Absolutely. Well, many of you need no introduction to Christa Brown, but Christa, just to give a little bit of an introduction for those of you who may be less familiar, Christa was named as one of the top 100 religion newsmakers of 2022. Christa has persisted for decades in working to peel back the truth about clergy sex abuse and cover-ups in the SBC. Of course, many of you are familiar with the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant denomination here in the U.S. She was one of the first to go public with substantiated child sexual abuse allegations against a Baptist minister, along with the documentation that others knew about this and didn't do more to stop it or respond in a godly way. And she has consistently demanded more reforms to make other kids and congregants safer in churches. Christa is a retired attorney. She's a mom. She's a grandma. And now she's the author of the new book, BaptistLand, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation. So if you have not gotten your copy yet of BaptistLand, please go get it wherever books are sold. The foreword to BaptistLand, of course, was written by none other than the founder of Grace, Boz Tchividjian. So before we dive in and talk about the book, I just want to lay out a little bit of the landscape of the book. so people who aren't as familiar or haven't gotten it yet will understand. So this is essentially a memoir you wrote about your own life. It's structured around what you call the 4 deaths in your life, 4 deaths and resurrections in those experiences. And you talk about that story and the culture of BaptistLand in which those 4 deaths and resurrections occurred. Um, like toward the end of the book, page 301, you write, BaptistLand is even broader than the SBC. People who don't go to church at all may still find themselves in BaptistLand. And to continue quoting, because you say BaptistLand is also a belief system that permeates broad swaths of our nation's culture, affecting how we structure our relationships, how we raise our children, and how we view others and ourselves. It is a belief system that implicitly diminishes the inherent worth of human beings. At its roots, the theology of BaptistLand is a theology of domination. It focuses not on human flourishing, but on the controlling of human beings through hierarchies of power and oppression. It proclaims as divinely ordered that some should hold dominion over those deemed lesser, and it invokes religion to rationalize categories of who should exercise authority and who should submit. No one should ever forget that the Southern Baptist Convention has its very origins in a grotesquely depraved theology that sanctified the enslavement of human beings, consecrated the Confederacy, and birthed the bloody Civil War. These roots remain, and they continue to feed the branches of BaptistLand. As William Faulkner said, the past is never dead, it is not even past. So that's the end quote. And I'll just say, if that doesn't convince you, that paragraph doesn't convince you to go buy the book, hopefully the rest of our conversation will. And that's our simple goal today. So again, thank you for joining us. Our simple goal is just to talk about some of the themes in the book with Christa and hear from her. And we believe this will be very beneficial to all of you who've joined and tuned in. Those of you who are maybe perhaps in a place of caring for others, whether it's in a church or outside of a church, whether you're a survivor, whether you're a church leader, you have responsibilities within or outside of a church of caring for others. I think these themes will be very helpful to anyone who tunes in. All right, so let's dive in. Christa, I get the first question. So would you please just talk a little bit about why you wrote this book? And you'd previously told some of this story before in a previous work called This Little Light, Beyond a Baptist Preacher, Predator, and His Gang. Highly recommended also, by the way, go buy This Little Light. And I wonder, so just talk a little bit about why you wrote the book. And though it's only been out for a short time, have some of your goals or hopes for the book, have you already seen some of that come to pass, even in the short time it's been published?
Yeah, I wrote this book, I think primarily with 2 groups of people in mind. One, of course, always on my heart are other survivors, other clergy sex abuse survivors. And I hope that some part of this book can help other survivors better understand their own experience and hopefully validate some of their feelings. And so many people travel this awful unchosen path of being sexually abused by a spiritual leader, and then this massive betrayal by a powerful religious institution. And there are a lot of people trying to kind of claw their way out of this very dark place. And so I always hold those people in mind because I'm one, and hope that it can be helpful. But I also wrote it for anyone really who is trying to understand or who wants to better understand how the religious culture in this country influences us in the US, and not always in ways that are good. And so I hope people will see in my story how faith can be exploited for ends that are often wholly unholy. And so that group of people also, I hope, will gain something from this. So far, the response has been very gratifying. I've certainly heard from a lot of survivors who've said that it means a lot to them. And so I'm glad for that. But I have been more surprised by the number of people I've heard from who were not sexually abused, but who still see pieces in this story that resonate with them and their own upbringing in this broader culture of BaptistLand. And so I think that's been a good thing. At least I'm grateful for it.
Wonderful. That's exciting to hear. David,
Yeah.
you're up.
Christa, one of the things you mentioned really throughout the book is how these predator ministers, in spite of being called out, in spite of being caught, they continue to prosper. You know, they prosper and we're the ones that suffer. How do you, or even have you, been able to reconcile that with a Christian church that claims to care for kids?
I don't think you can reconcile it. I really don't. Of course, I'm speaking predominantly here about the Southern Baptist Convention, which is where I've been most involved. They have known for decades about this pervasive problem of pastors sexually abusing kids and congregants. Decades. That's documented. It's not even really factually up for debate anymore. They have known. There have been multiple exposés. They've had multiple opportunities to earnestly reckon with this, and they have not. So no, I don't think you can. You can't reconcile it. If the Southern Baptist Convention were an institution that actually really cared about the safety of children, then it would have directed significant resources to addressing the problem. They would have prioritized it, and they have not done that. And so all their talk about precious children, it's wholly hollow. And that's how I reconcile it. The talk is hollow. The reality is institutionally, they do not care.
That's
I
powerful.
hear you.
Yeah, and I love how you write in the book that this was a reality you could not accept. And that's what drove you to do your advocacy work. You were just, as a person, as a human, as a mother, you said, I can't accept this because you can't reconcile it. And that drove you to do all that you've done and write all that you've written in the hope that we can see some change and others will continue to join you, as many have, David and others, stepping up and speaking up. Absolutely.
That's exactly right. Years ago, if someone had told me all this, I myself would not have believed it, because it's very, very dark to imagine that human beings will not safeguard the well-being of children.
Absolutely. So your book, BaptistLand, continues and is a little broader in some respects than your first book. And you talk a little bit more in BaptistLand about some of the abuse and cruelty you faced within your own home and in your own family. And I know many of our listeners, unfortunately, I know it statistically, many of them will be able to relate to that. And that's a key point of education for us here at Grace when we work with churches, is many churches are unaware of how common abuse is in the home, and that prevention efforts have to be more holistic and not just during Sunday school hour or youth group meeting, but more holistic. And we want the things we're doing in prevention and building a safe culture to pervade and radiate out into the home. I think that's essential. You talk about in powerful ways just what it was like and some of your experiences. One of the things that stood out is when you traveled to Germany as a young woman, you had a trip, right? And you went and you stayed in a home where you said there was no yelling, there was no throwing things, and it was like this new experience. And it helped you make sense of, hey, maybe what I grew up with is not, it helped you make sense of that experience. I loved it when you wrote, again, further on in the book, you wrote about, you made this wonderful statement. You said, I finally knew for sure that I could not work on healing myself while constantly having my experience invalidated and belittled. It wasn't possible. I had to choose. I chose me. Those words I just thought were so powerful. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of that choice and healing and how that's related? And maybe then go on to say, what would you say to a survivor who's maybe is even listening right now, who is feeling the weight of that choice?
You know, talking about family, this was another reason that I really wanted to write this book. Because I have heard these stories from other survivors and listened to these stories so frequently, of their family stories, and not only stories about things in their upbringing that they felt rendered them more vulnerable to abuse or to being targeted, but also terribly, stories of how when they began to speak out, of how their families did not support them. And I've heard these stories for years, and yet they are stories that we don't tend to talk about much. And that is precisely because they are so painful. And ultimately, that was why I thought I needed to talk about it and wanted to talk about it. You know, when religious leaders sexually abuse a child, it doesn't affect only the child. It often has these seismic repercussions for the entire family, that continue over the course of years. And so I wanted to talk about that. And that choice that many survivors wind up confronting, the choice between family or self, that is an incredibly painful choice. It was a choice I ultimately had to make. And I know many other survivors do as well. It's not a choice anyone wants. For me, I think the only thing that would have been more painful would have been if I had sacrificed and negated my own reality, for the sake of something that was false. And ultimately, I couldn't do that. And to other survivors who are making this choice, which is a really god-awful choice, I hope that in my book you might see something to help you hope that there can be joy on the other side of that choice, because I think there is. But mostly what I would say to anyone who is dealing with the weight of that choice, be gentle with yourself. Be gentle, because whatever you do, it is just such an awful place to be, and such a painful choice. So I would say, number one, be gentle. And number two, I would hope that you would not sacrifice the truth of your own reality for the sake of something false. In the long run, I think that's even more painful.
It's amazing words. Thank you for that, Krista. There were a lot of lines. I was going to say there was a line that shook me, but there were a lot, because so much what you're saying, so much of what you're saying, I related to, and I know others that I've spoken with have related to it. There was one in particular where you were having a conversation with your mom, and I can even hear the tone of a relative of mine where your mom said, "Don't be silly. Stewardesses are supposed to be pretty." And I cried when I read that. I didn't just cry for you. I cried for me, because I heard my granny saying, because she could just be so cruel at times to me. The same person that's supposed to love me could be so incredibly cruel. Why do you think it is that in the same households where the words of Jesus and the words of Paul, flow so freely, these words of cruelty flow so freely? And what would you say to church leaders about that?
I don't know why some people are cruel. It's something that I truly don't really understand. And I think a lot of theologians and philosophers don't either. But what I do know, or at least what I believe, is that these kinds of casual cruelties, these casual small cruelties, like what you're talking about, Dave, that are,
Just throw them out.
yeah, they are not without consequence. Those kinds of casual, small cruelties have an impact. And as human beings, they erode our empathy. We begin to take cruelty as something normal. And that in turn then paves the way for bigger cruelties.
Right.
And as for what I would say to religious leaders, I would say to a lot of them, stop it. Because there are a lot of church leaders who model cruelty, particularly towards survivors, but in all sorts of ways. They are modeling cruelty and even rationalizing and legitimizing it sometimes as being something righteous. And that's just wrong. And I'm sorry that you were able to relate to that part of my book, because I get it.
Fortunately, a major theme of your book is choosing to seek out people and things that sustain life. You go through a number of things. Could you share a little bit about your support systems, places, activities, things that helped you with these cruelties and the abuses? What's helped you in your own health and healing?
Well, I live in the mountains, and that's a good starting place for me. It has been. It's been a very good thing for me. I do think that we need to train ourselves to seek out beauty and respite, because when we're immersed in this, I mean, child sexual abuse and the systems that sustain it and enable it, this is something very, very dark. And it's,
Yeah.
I know I can go down this trail of being really immersed in this darkness. And so I have to really consciously have to shift my thoughts and focus on things that are good. And I have to sometimes force myself to do that, to train myself to do that. And I do think that for me, walking in the mountains is a really good thing. Walking and just noticing what's around me helps to ground me in the here and now, in this safe place here and now, in this reality. And I think for those of us who have had our own bodies so violated, that it behooves us, I think, to try to adopt practices of embodiment that feels safe and good, like walking and hiking and yoga and dance. And in all of these ways, we learn to feel better in our bodies. And I think some of us need that. And I would also just say for childhood sexual abuse survivors, we've got research on this, lots of research. The massive ACE study, ACE,
Right.
which
Yeah.
is about adverse childhood experiences, shows that these things, these extremely adverse experiences like childhood sexual abuse, can affect us long into the future physiologically,
Right.
increasing even the risk for cancer, shortening the lifespan. And so I guess what I would urge for childhood sexual abuse survivors, I mean, there's nothing fair about it, right?
Right.
But because we know now that this has this physiological negative thing going on that affects us for so long into adulthood, I think it behooves us to try to ameliorate that. Maybe we have to work harder at trying to ameliorate that and taking steps to care for ourselves, to really be focused on self-care. And I think that's important.
Be selfish about self-care.
Yes, exactly. Very good. Yes.
But that's the thing, it's not selfish, right?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
It's just showing yourself basic human self-respect, which is wherever you are religiously. As a Christian, I have no problem saying that's about the most God-honoring thing I can think of how we should be treating ourselves, right?
Right.
So yeah, and I would just say, first of all, even if you're a survivor of not just sexual abuse, the ACE study encompasses emotional abuse, it encompasses physical abuse and other things. So same message to really any survivor of any form of abuse listening. David, you of course are a very public survivor and advocate as well. Can you maybe just same question? Can I just turn this conversation
Turn the
a little
table.
bit toward you for a
Yeah.
second? Is that allowed?
Yeah.
Are there things that have made a difference in this area in your life? Anything you would add or share with our audience?
Survivor groups, support groups. If it weren't for SNAP, I mean, I was hanging by a thread, and I found Christa's book, and either through her, I don't remember if Christa, if you were the one that got me over to Dave and Barbara, or anyway, but survivor groups, find books like Christa's or books that other survivors recommend, so that you can understand that this thing that you feel so alone about, you can understand that you're not alone in it. I had the good fortune of something that most survivors don't. Christa touched on this. Most survivors don't have the support of their family. I don't know if it's what number above 50% it is, but I would wager, based on conversations and experiences with other survivors, it's a lot higher than that. I've been blessed with a mom and aunts that have believed me, loved me, supported me, and without them, I know I'd be dead. I mean, that's not hyperbole.
Yeah.
And lots of writing. I know for most people, there are at least a lot of folks, when they hear, well, I need to journal, it doesn't do anything for them. For me, it has been. And it's not like I sit down and I'm writing out all of my serious thoughts. Sometimes it's just writing on a scratch piece of paper, right? It's just a way to get my emotion out, so that I can formulate the thought, feel the feelings that I need to feel. And that helps me with that healing. So
yeah, wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. Christa, you talk in the book a lot about the importance of setting boundaries and saying no. And, in the culture you were raised in, which many of us were raised in also, a culture of submission, of just be compliant, and that's the main goal, right, in that culture. You talk about growing to understand the need to set personal boundaries, to say no, and the importance of self-respect when you are faced with disrespect and when you make that decision and say that no, like your family or others trying to push you off of that decision. Um, you talk about you needed to be able to set those boundaries and have that respected for your own health and healing. So we talked about practices and mountains and and yoga and exercise, but talk about boundaries in that regard and just share maybe a little bit with our audience about how you came to these realizations about boundaries and why that's been so important in your story.
Well, I think it is important, but for me, it certainly hasn't been easy. I would say boundaries are something I'm not really very good at, and something that I am always working on.
Mhm.
Like so many things related to this, it's been a process and still is a
Mhm.
process. For me, I would say that dealing with cancer went a long way toward finally really driving home
Mhm.
this need for boundaries and for giving me some clarity there. Because in that process, I wound up realizing that I simply had no hope for healing so long as I was trying to constantly appease others.
Mhm.
I had to learn to value myself. I mean, it felt like a life or death thing for me. I
Mhm.
had to learn to value myself. And I
Mhm.
think that is sometimes a hard thing. I think one of the things that childhood sexual abuse inculcates in us is this message that says we don't have any value. And then when the faith group itself does nothing, they reinforce that message that we hold no value or worth.
Mhm.
And so this is something that doesn't tend to come naturally for some of us. And I think having boundaries is a good thing, and it is a reflection of valuing ourselves.
Mhm.
Um, and I would just say to people, boundaries are your own, and no one owes any apology or explanation for who or what they choose to protect themselves from, for setting that boundary. And that includes both protecting against individuals and institutions.
Mhm.
Set your boundaries, and you don't even owe an explanation or an apology.
Absolutely. Thank you.
100%. So when describing there again, there was just these, I mean, there was so much impact your book had on me. There were places when it was just these large, sections, but there were always also these just lines that just, popped off the page at me. And one of them was when you talked about descriptions than explanations. I'll read. I just want to say you said when you live in a crazy house, you sometimes grasp for crazy answers. You get more descriptions than explanations. And I got that. I knew because I heard the same thing. But can you explain more to your readers what you mean by that and why it might be important to them?
Yeah, I think human beings, we want really desperately sometimes to understand things. And part of that, I think, is because if we understand something, we might be able to control it. And if we can control it, then we'll be safer because we can have some control and we can control what happens. So we like to imagine that we're in control, and the reality is a lot of times we aren't, of course.
Not
You know, um, and what I mean by this, when you grow up in a crazy house, you sometimes search for crazy answers because you're so desperate for any kind of answer.
anything.
I used to wish that my father were a drinker. He wasn't, because, of course, he was Baptist. But but I used to wish for that because I thought that if only he were a drinker, it would explain why he had this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde persona, why sometimes he was so terrifying and other times everything was smooth. Of course, that was a crazy thing to wish for. Undoubtedly, it would have made things infinitely worse. And yet, I think that's a reflection of how badly human beings want sometimes to have explanations. But you know, the reality is we don't get explanations, and we still have to deal with reality. I mean, why do so many pastors sexually abuse the young and vulnerable? I don't have an answer for that. I can't answer the why of it. But the fact that I don't have an explanation for it doesn't alter the reality of it and the need for that to be dealt with.
I love that. Thank you for that. That's because we hear that in churches so much, so many times we go to teach the safeguarding, right? That's what they want to know. All that they want. Why do they? Why? It doesn't matter why.
Right.
Here's what you can do to protect. Here's what you can do to, you know, you're getting hung up on things that have no relevance on how you're going to be able to prepare and respond and move forward. Thank you for sharing that, because that's why, again, that's another reason why I love so much of what you said in your book.
Not exactly what you said, Dave. I second all of that. Yeah.
Christa, in your book, I think one of the major themes that kept coming back up you wrote about is just the power of truth and truth telling. And in one section of the book, you write, so I'll quote you here. You wrote, "In looking back, I see distinct times when my life transformed most profoundly. All of these were times when I was beset by uncertainty and profoundly humbled by my lack of knowing, by my fear, and by my lack of a path. All of them demanded self-trust and brutal honesty. It was only by stilling myself to see the truth of my own lived experience and then placing trust in that truth that I was able to take ownership of my life." When I read that and thought about it, you know, I was thinking about how do churches move forward with this problem of abuse in the church? And I was thinking, if churches would just do what you are describing that you had to do, they might have a path forward, ironically, right? And, you know, it probably is the only way forward for a culture to become more self-aware, right? And a culture that constantly undermines the ability of people to trust their own lived experience. That's part of the core problem that we face, right? In churches. And churches need, and you know, church leaders especially need to sit and reflect upon what has gone wrong that we raise people not to trust their own lived experience, to make decisions in that way you described, which is essential for just to be a human being. So just, I don't know what my question is, maybe, sorry, but I don't know, maybe just talk about that idea that you write about and maybe the path forward. Is there a path forward there in that way, or whatever you want, wherever you want to take that, go for it.
Well, I do think that in order to move beyond the past, we have to grapple with the past and see the reality of the past. And yeah, I think truth holds power as a moral force in the universe. And I'm going to quote Sarah Stancorb here, author of Disobedient Women. I would guess some of you might have read that book as well. Sarah once wrote, "How does a person, let alone an institution, heal without great, painful residence in the truth?" That word, residence in the truth. We aren't talking some passing glance here or some fleeting acquaintanceship. Residence in the truth. We must take up residence in the truth, and that is something painful. So far, the Southern Baptist Convention has not been willing to do this. Institutionally, it remains focused on its own image. But I think that is exactly what is needed. Truth is the catalyst for change. That's what I believe, and it must be a sustained and earnest encounter with the truth. That is the path forward. But it's also a very painful and fearsome path, I think, for many. And this is why a cowardly institution like the Southern Baptist Convention, one that is mired for decades in deception and duplicity, avoids it. I hope that other faith institutions will show more courage.
You wrote, while truth telling carried a heavy cost, it was for me the only way forward, the only way I could become healthy and whole. And I felt that to my core, to my DNA. And I just want to make, I know I've said this to you for countless times. This is the first time I actually get to say it to you face to face, as it were. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for helping so many others know that they're not alone, and that know that by speaking that truth, they can move forward as well. You're so very much appreciated, Christa.
Thank you, Dave. It's just such an honor for me to be here with you face to face, sort of.
Right.
Thanks.
So on a much sourer note, though, oftentimes, all of us as survivors, we get accused of trying to destroy the church, right? That's the thing. I was with Barbara Blaine down at the Miami diocese. They were trying to expose this predator priest that was down there, and they were the reporters were going down the line, and he got, right, CBS got right in my face with the mic and the camera. He was like, "Are you trying to bankrupt the Catholic Church? Are you trying to destroy the Roman Catholic Church?" And all I can do is just roll my eyes and go, "Dude, have you heard a word that we've said? Right? That's not what this is about." Or you're trying to bring down the name of Jesus. And this is what we hear a lot. I know you've heard that and a whole lot worse. How do you respond when those types of accusations come your way?
My goal has never been about destroying the church or destroying any church. My goal has always been about protecting and helping human beings. So first of all, especially children. So first of all, to those who say that, I would say that is simply false. And second, if you have a cancer, what often has to happen is that it has to be cut out. And this can be a very destructive process for the body. But even knowing that, you do what has to be done. You don't protect the cancer. You don't pretend you don't have cancer, not if you want to live. You don't, you burn it out, you poison it, you do whatever it takes to get rid of it, because a dreadful adversary often requires very difficult and painful measures. And finally, I'd say this, if what we're talking about is a church that still refuses even the most
Oh, did we lose Christa?
Yeah, I'm wondering if the power went back out again in Colorado.
Okay. Yeah. Christa was fighting the internet outage earlier and thought it was resolved, but we might have lost her for a sec. So David, why don't we just
I'm glad we got, and I know we're going to give some time to try and get her back in.
Yeah.
I am so glad that folks got to hear, most of how she was answering that question, it's the opposite, right? Not Christa, not me, not any survivor who names a known offender, who names a known abuse. That's what it's about. It's about cutting out that cancer, the thing that's the thing which destroys the body.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking truth won't.
Yeah, it mystifies me. Someone trying to help the church do better to protect children is accused. Like, that is just, it's very revealing, the whole framing of it, right? It shows the depth of the corruption, maybe, or the deception at work, and the work that needs to be done. That is the framing. Trying to help churches protect children gets called out as trying to bring it down. Someone who equates the church where there's corruption and abuse, well, that's what, that on some level, without maybe even realizing it and having the self-awareness to realize, that's where they're saying needs to be preserved. Yeah, it's unreal. Well, while audience, thanks for sticking with us. We're hoping to get Christa back. We're just going to keep going until we get her back. If we do,
let me
David,
do something while we're live here. Let me do
Yeah.
something fun and live. Let
Okay.
me actually text, because that was that we
Yeah,
found
yeah.
that was
Well,
the only way that you could get through at times when the power went
Yeah.
out. Was so let me actually
well,
see
while
it.
you're doing that, I'll just say one of my favorite chapters I thought was most profound was the chapter she wrote called Motherhood. And she said just some quotes that really, like you said, there were things that just popped off the page at you. I had the same experience. There were just things that popped out at me in that chapter, especially all throughout, but that chapter. She wrote, so often she writes, in the process of mothering her daughter, Stacy,
Mhm.
who's now grown, right?
Right.
She said, I had to mother myself, and ultimately I became the person I am because I was Stacy's mother. She had to work through and parent herself. And I know many of our audience can relate to that on some level. She also wrote in that chapter, to be a good mother, I had to learn to matter to myself. Those persistent, pervasive messages she was getting in her home. And she said, I had to learn to matter to myself, both for her daughter's sake and for her own sake. And she said, that sounds simple in words, but it never was. That just stood out to me. And then,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah. And then the last one, she said, becoming a mother meant confronting the legacy of my own mother. More and more I could see that the wounded child I held within me was also the inner child of mom and dad. And I have conversations, David, all the time, and I'm sure you do as well, with survivors who the conversation gets to, at a certain point, how do we convince our parents to go to therapy? Because so many dig in and refuse to go. But Christa clearly had to wrestle with that legacy and work
Right.
on herself and and she writes about going to therapy and having to kind of parent herself and mature. And, we just need to see that from more people to do that work.
That was another thing that was so consequential for me getting to the place where I am now.
Yeah.
So Krista says her computer is rebooting
Okay.
slowly.
So hopefully she'll be back soon. So we'll keep going until then.
But I hear you about,
Yeah.
because if I hadn't, I mentioned the small groups and mentioned the other stuff. There is absolutely no way at all, if I hadn't had someone who under a therapist who understood trauma, 1 hour, and said they were trauma informed. I mean, somebody who actually truly understood trauma. And if they can't tell you that, show you that, how many clients, how many hours,
Right.
take a pass and go to somebody else.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. Well, and it's unfortunate that so many in the church are against therapy. And I always tell people from Grace, like, look, we're not here to tell you how to, we're not here to tell you not to be Baptist or not to be Presbyterian or not to be Methodist or, how you should think about every issue. That's not our job. But, being trauma informed is just accepting of a part of God's truth and God's reality. And of course, counselors who refuse to work and gain the skills to understand trauma, of course, and counselors that reject, an evidence-based approach in some cases have done some tremendous harm over the years. So,
Well, because so often the pushback that we will get is from Christians and churches is that, well, this is a sin issue.
mhm,
And what we're trying to explain is we hear you. We understand what you mean
mhm,
by that. But we're talking about crimes, okay?
yeah,
So let's talk about the crimes first, the consequences of those, the things that when Jesus commit from at least my very simple understanding of Jesus's history,
mhm,
before every time there was a miracle, there was some sort of physical, or before there was any spiritual insight, right? There was this physical thing that took place. He took care of the immediate physical need before the spiritual could be understood, right? If
mhm,
people are hungry, they're not going to hear a word you say, so he fed them. If
mhm,
somebody can't walk, they can't get to do those things that they need to do. So he healed them. That's what we're talking about with counseling.
mhm,
If you don't understand the trauma of the crimes and you handle those properly, if you don't handle those properly, then that victim nor the perpetrator are ever going to get to the point spiritually where they need to be.
yeah, yeah. David, we got a question from the audience for Krista, but I thought you could answer this, I bet, really well. So, do you mind if I put you on the spot?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. Yep.
Okay, just do your best. Here we go. So someone in the audience asked, how would you advise others who desire to speak up about their abuse, in the light of what you've learned? So you've had a similar journey in some respects. Everyone's journey is their own and unique. But in some respects, you've had a similar journey to Krista's and a life of public advocacy spanning years. So I'm sure you would have some good insight on this. So how would you advise someone? Because many survivors have never talked about their story, or
Right.
never gone public, or never started doing public advocacy work. So just maybe talk about that a little. What would you advise?
I'll share the first thing that comes to my mind is something that I was when I first just said publicly, not when I actually made it, to where the world could know it, but just when I came forward publicly to family or close
Mhm,
friends. In that moment, we used to say, charge hell with a squirt gun, right? I was ready to, okay, I
yeah.
said it. Now I'm ready to go out and I want to get all these predators. I want to tell everybody. I want to show
Mhm,
this is how you can correct all of these wrongs.
mhm,
And in that moment, I had a fellow survivor tell me, no, that
yeah.
would be bad for you.
Yeah.
You need to take as long as it takes.
Yeah.
And this is where she said, and I can't tell you how long that's going to be. It may be 6 months, it may be
Hmm.
6 years, but
Hmm.
you need to get to the place where when you're sharing your story, that you don't,
Yeah.
lose it.
Yeah.
Where when you're sharing or trying to help others, right, you're not looking in shock and awe because now you're freaking them out. You have to be, and this is both personally I believe this and professionally I believe that was the greatest counsel I could have
Hmm.
ever been given, was
Hmm.
to take time to heal, to learn things, not just
Hmm.
about yourself, but about the world of advocacy. Because it's not exactly what you may think it is.
Right.
It's amazing work, but it's also overwhelming at times.
It's tough.
And so two things, so quick little thing there, it was 5 years.
Mhm.
5 years from the time I came forward to the time I started professionally doing
Mhm.
advocacy.
Mhm. Yep.
As long as it takes for you to get to that
Yep.
point.
Yep.
That really is the biggest thing I would say.
Yeah. And I love what you say there, that it's probably going to be different for everybody, you know, and just to be attentive and try to work on that self-awareness. Absolutely. Well, let's just take 2 minutes with one last question, David, if you'll allow me.
Sure.
Despite the framing of Christa's book as 4 deaths, she also talks about 4 deaths that led to transformation and resurrection, essentially.
Yeah.
There's a lot of hope in that book. As hard as it is to read, as hard as there's some really hard things in there's a lot of hope in that book. And I know you're able to speak to that dynamic too. You know, despite maybe not feeling very hopeful about, certain denominations or certain leaders in general or specifically, there is hope in this world. I think we all believe that. So
Yeah.
would you just take just a minute or so, and let's close out with that question. Where do you find hope?
We wouldn't be having this conversation
Yeah.
right now if we didn't have some measure of hope about something somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And ours is very, very specific. I find hope in survivors helping survivors, right? Because I believe there is hope for individual survivors, for victims who are currently still trapped in situations they need to be rescued from. Their families need to know how to do that. And they need to know, okay, well, who do I call? It's not about what to do now. They just need to know the first step. So that's what we want to do, offer hope for them. In the rooms of Narcotics Anonymous, they have a saying: the therapeutic value of one addict helping another is without parallel. Without parallel. That's where I find so much hope, is one survivor helping another. It's why I said to Christa, and I tell her this all the time, when I read her first book, I thought I was the only person in the world who had experienced what I had. That was the moment I found out I wasn't. And then I started putting feelers out about finding out, oh, it wasn't just me, it was several other guys, and not just at this church. Okay, they give me hope that we can help each other.
Yeah.
And for individual churches in that moment who ask for help. It doesn't carry over, for eternity. It doesn't, forgive or atone for past crimes or wrongs, because there's always going to be, need more work. But that's where my hope lies, is for those churches in that moment, individual churches, and the individual survivors.
Right. Thank you, David. Thanks for co-hosting this. Again, to our audience, we apologize that the infrastructure issues, the internet where Christa is, which was acting up earlier and we thought was resolved, led to her getting,
She sent a message. She says, I feel so badly. If people want to send questions after the webinar, she'll try to answer. So just,
okay.
She'll do some things that way too.
We'll tell her, please don't feel bad, be kind to herself. And we appreciate, we got a good 40 minutes with her, which
we did.
That's 40 minutes of pure gold. So Christa is such a treasure. So we thank you, Christa. Please go get BaptistLand if you haven't already. Thanks everyone for joining. Again, apologies that we didn't get Christa for the whole time. But I know what you did get was incredibly valuable. So thank you all. We appreciate you joining in and taking part of your day. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
When I'm clinging to your light, you will make the darkness bright. For you